Greetings and welcome to Liminal Light, a show that explores the languages of myth and star, earth, sky, tongue, and spirit through weekly astrological forecasts. I'm your host, Chris. Enjoy. When something with girth and gravity is lobbed into water, it makes not only a splash, but a heart-slapping pulse of depth audible. This is the case when giant spheres in space wander from one long-known territory of the Earth's sky into another. To us, tiny torchlights meandering in an open field of darkness amongst glimmering diamonds set by some distant and extant jeweler. A piercer through the membrane, revealing what milk pours through the camera obscura into the sphere of stone upon which we surf and volley. The roots of the zodiac are old, both etymologically and in cognitive myth. Coming from Greek via zodion, animals, and translating to literally circle of animals, the Proto-Indo-European root kwe, which means to live, haunts the old tongue mechanics of zodiac, which in Greek context we find under overturned stones, both bios, one's life, course or way of living, lifetime, and zoe, animal life, organic life. The zodiac is a circle of animals which are alive and organic, and the light wandering through them stimulates and catalyzes natural and unfolding processes. They are not simply zones, but as the decans and mansions both are, spirits themselves, sentient and active. It's much easier for us to give the planets life and personality. They could be measured with the eye and be touched and tasted if we were to travel great distances. But the subtle quality of they that hang to the ecliptic invisibly are more elusive. Christian mystics and those that preceded in their historical shadow saw a retinue of angels in the sky. It was a populated place and legioned. We are familiar with Indian depictions of avatars and chains of being and rank behind central characters, such as depicted on the cover of Axis Bold as Love, but less so in Olympic pantheons, where the gods tend to shapeshift in their dramas rather than split off and deploy second versions of themselves to do their deeds elsewhere in manifestation. Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and the rest, it has been suggested, are such versions of Olympic deities proper. In the Roman sense, these would then also be rank and file of the planets, who populate the skies and interact with the more primal beasts of the zodiac, where the clashing and coalescing of angels, spirits, gods, and animals mixes with varied chemistry, like people and their personalities thrown together into melee or mingle. The Thema Mundi and the traditional dignities begin to make more holistic sense. Haunts and hangouts of certain planets where they and their entourage are more welcome and celebrated by the throngs that cohabitate that space. When celestial bodies enter degrees that cramp their style, it is as if hooligans flood your regular watering hole. Unless you are yourself also a hooligan, and it is your hole, of course. This creates a tension that limits the activity in that space for either party, hooligan and non. This bar is for angels only, and there is not the place for balls and brawls. Uranus has recently pushed himself through the plate glass of the corner pub and sent shards of glass like lightning bolt trinkets showering into all the mash and meatloaf, so forkfuls hang in suspense before mouths, and pints of ale sit suspect across the bar. Mars, meanwhile, did similar into the establishment catty corner across the square, and in the combined commotion of their double penetration, accidents and sudden occurrences churned in the wake. The game pieces scattered and the regular sequence of checkers becomes augmented, and in fact might never be the same. The trowels and hand hoes and other farming implements remember the torture of the forge and blush a glowing red, readying for change. The reports I've been hearing from people for the past few weeks all include things scarier or more rare than the chains falling off their bicycles mid-ride. Some of it has been good, and some of it has been bad, and much of it is in between. A circlet of surprise and spherical storm, spitting sparks betwixt the bull's horns, that concerns us more than the stampedes and gorgings. Here is the thought bubble as it rises from the test tube, frothing with mud and menses mingling, sexual fluids and herbal elixir stirred with gouges, and carving chisels and cutlery. It glimmers with viriditas, and over the spectral pastoral vortex von Bingen smiles and calls for wormwood wine, the crescent of her devilish smirk worrying the church authorities more than her fresco mandalas or botany sketches or secular sequentia. The earth rumbles, the womb shakes, fertility falters, and in the interim, AI and the thing both become more eerily probable than before. Our famous and infamous and nefarious flickering light bulbs portend change, as they tend to in the sublunar realm generally, but now the Promethean fire has landed in the pasture of moon's exaltation, and steady rhythm of skin drums scatters into syncopation. Ready thyself, then, for ecstatic dance. Perfect time, really, as Saturn's stay in Capricorn has many gravitating towards leveling sobriety. It has been the ecstatic experience has been strictly self-initiated since last winter's solstice. Nobody's handing out rave flyers in the streets and subway stations of the sky, shall we say. But now that Uranus has ingress Taurus, the shake-up is on for better or for worse, and more than simple stimulants secretly percolate in the morning coffee, making for an interesting harvest as crops come up in surprising shapes, and especially at alarming rates. The rewilding movement lays in wait for imminent boost. Both of the moon's houses are haunted, hers and her friend Venus's, as she will encounter Uranus by conjunction in Taurus each month, and then by sextile in Cancer, better over there than over here, where she also encounters Saturn by opposition. This is visceral stuff, we can feel it. So all that transpired in 2018 thus far has been sandwiched between two interesting solstitial events. The Sun passing into Capricorn last winter hand in hand with Saturn, and then passing into sextile to Uranus when the king comes to call the kingdom of Cancer. Interesting symmetry in an eclipse period triggering the crown upon the lion, as the bells being shadow-rung are in the sun sign axis, with both luminaries locked in a strange bout of badminton, much as afoot, clearly seen and clearly felt. We can talk more about it as the messenger himself swims across Cancer, entering the middle of the pool in Cancer's second decan at 2 p.m. on Sunday, June 17th. Here he achieves dignity of face in the Chaldean order scheme. This allows him the ability to lend his logic and language to the expression of needs and emotions, communicating in a way that soothes, protects, and nurtures, like speaking balms and charms of healing speech that may protect our minds and carry our voices with meaning. The voice of the home, the intelligence of the womb, as well as the clarity to analyze and organize our dreams. There's magical potential here, especially as the moon is waxing, and not necessarily from astrological dignity alone, but from context. Dream work, protection spells, mercantile manifestation, invocations stream off the tongue as from gentle fountains and babble and water features which improve feng shui. Maybe a fine time to petition to the lares and penates, or ask what needs they may have and nurture a mutually beneficial relationship. An especially fine time to milk Mercury comes at 3:45 p.m. on Tuesday, when communicating needs harmonizes with deep coherence of intense or primal engagements. What is the spiritual depth of coupling to mate, or the philosophy of the wild hunt, spelling out in alphabets of predator and prey? Traumas are likely vocalized, but wombs may wander around the body as Neptune lays in wait to trine both planets from only a degree's space. Put it in poetic form rather than try to rationalize it. There is likely to be something there stirring the waters, but it could be zoologically impossible to categorize. Trust the bower mist to whisper in the garden, but don't cross the wall when they beckon or be abducted by fae, unless of course that is your intention. Simply be forewarned that undines swim here and the Sibylline can snatch your story and then sink to deleterious depths. Ask the oracle what you wish, but don't believe every word they say, literally at least. Pocket the poesy, but later look, a gazing stone to add to your satchel. The scrying might prove quite interesting as Venus steps upon the North Node earlier that morning at 9 a.m. As eclipse season draws closer, we may watch for sensitivities, ponder what increase she might engender as one within the spotlight, able to seduce with aesthetic and pull pleasure from attention. Not a bad time for casting love charms, so watch for her hour. And maybe eclipse event precognition could be possible, especially in composing self-portraits or planning out strategic ensembles. It would make sense to compare to Mars's extended stay hovering over the south node, that opposite effects that might have made in your life. What manic, maverick energy persists in your intellectual fringe? How does that relate to relationships, aesthetic, or creativity on the seat of imbalanced increase in visibility, truth, and virtue? Watch this day for creative relationship characters in rapid manifestation. Midweek marks the moon square sun at 7 a.m. on Wednesday, June 20th, and a ramp-up of energy from the vision of myriad possibilities, in tension against the intuitive awareness of processes closing, turning to emotions of balance and justice as moon ingresses Libra. Later that night, Mercury accomplishes the trine to Neptune, dissolving the boundaries and expressing emotional needs after getting caught up on the coherence of intense engagements. This would certainly be a time to pinch yourself and remember that you might be tripping. Even if there is stuff around to support your apophenia, remember the world is weird and often with a Y instead of an EI. Sometimes delusions prove to be true, and that is the secret to psychic solution. But to filter the serum, you've got to be ambivalent to its presence. We should always follow threads of synchronicities, but as we tug on them to see where they lead, we must also pull back and look at what the whole picture might suggest, rather than get tangled up in the rigging of the SS Coincidence as it sails away into open seas with us as hapless stowaways. This is applied poetics. Even Robert Graves eventually admitted that The White Goddess was a crazy book and he should have never wrote it. Despite this afterthought, traditional craft still regularly burns with its pages for light. You may be onto something this Wednesday, but heed well which way you frame it. On Thursday, June 21st, the solar disk rolls into Cancerian waters at 6 a.m., marking summer solstice and the longest light of the year, when we can see our emotional selves clearly, and the long bath of light into the hours of night mingles rational vision and impression in a much safer way than Mercury's meetings with Neptune, even though this year they come in tandem. We see the world at night and watch colorful moths dance with fireflies and June bugs careen into broad barn sides. Nature chirps and chatters as the skies host both birds and bats. Frogs talk and porcupines part tall grass, portly from chaw of tender greens. They climb to the tips of treetops and drink from the moon. The spectacle of what the earth births seen clearly for its truth and what it generously gives, what it generates naturally. Our attention is drawn into identification with mother-child dynamics, both on the nurturing end of the spectrum as well as on the childish. We catch lightning bugs in jars and moisten their light with our petty tears, taking on emotional characters capable of creative attention. This is not a typical pass, and this is concluded quickly with Venus opposing Mars at 1 p.m. Ascetic, maverick, outsider action or aggression opposed to seductive beauty and overexposed aesthetics. Relationships that draw too much attention and full sight of impulses to escape centrality and act out on the frontiers. Attempting a balance between these polarities might help us navigate the tension successfully to victory. Venus as much as you Mars upon the tightrope of the eclipse axis. The cable is likely to be woven into our eclipse stories, and Mars retrograde stories, and Uranus and Taurus stories, so tread carefully amongst what might get tossed up. Over Friday, June 22nd, the play of dignities shift on our stage. At 9 a.m., Venus moves into Leo's second decan, where identifying and embodying the principles of pleasure and desire and a practical, no-frills hedonism installed as an honest character trait is displayed. Later on at 11 p.m., Mercury proceeds into Cancer's third phase. Logic of creative abundance, thoughts and expression of emotional philosophy and creative wellsprings. Sounds nice, but expect more emotional analytical distortion, as the messenger is no longer in his own decan. Where we source our creative and philosophical well water is a mark on the map we frequent. We as people must all admit to our own subjective confusions. When they are acknowledged, we are free to flaunt them, coloring the landscape we paint with subtle inflections, so the water is never flat blue, but cerulean, licked with pastel chartreuse and terracotta. In the wee hours of calendrical Sunday at 2 a.m., the sun sextiles Uranus. Mother-child dynamics or emotional characters seem able to work with sudden shifts in turbulence and fertility preparation and organic pace subject to material disruptions. This is interesting, and we'll see how soft this aspect between the luminary of day like Uranus's influence. We may see the poisoned world and how we've disrupted it from a mother's perspective, the mess we've made of our child, or we might look up and see our mother has new plans for our future. Convenient timing, and the plan sounds so crazy it might just work. It's time to understand the Earth and how the Earth creates differently from an emotional perspective. This lies at the heart of animistic paradigms. If everything is ensouled and has spirit, then it is a different form of engagement. We interact emotionally with things that are animate and alive. We then have more complex and nuanced empathy for everything. I believe animism is part of the story in Uranus and Taurus, and the sun's first sextile to the Promethean planet will likely make some things subtly clear on Saturday as we look across the world from the hilltop of summer. Scanning the scape, we make certain discoveries. In this case, they are game changers that flutter and fan our hearts. Mercury then faces Pluto in the celestial square dance at 5:30 a.m., another early morning aspect that alters what we wake up to. Logic of emotional or creative philosophy opposed to mysterious raw power in the dark depths of the earth or structural hierarchies of society. What the sun sees in Uranus, Mercury thinks long and hard about. Unprecedented trains of thought that trail into obscurity, the place where we initiate ourselves to the unknown, incorporating new technology, new tactics, adapting to mutations as we mature not only puts Promethean torchlight in our hands, but flips the lid of Pandora's box wide, and before chaos itself emerges, we stare deep into the void and contemplate in the classical sense. Well, I would like to welcome back to the show my cohort, Bonnie.
Hello, Chris. How are you?
Doing good. After our month-long break, I realized today we haven't done the show for, I think,
a month.
A whole month, yeah.
So the same forecast has been playing for the past month?
That's what I hear.
Well, guys, get ready.
Yeah,
the cutting-edge news.
Yeah, I was away. I was on the road visiting friends and reading, and then I went to the United Astrology Conference in Chicago, which was an insane, intense, 6-day long, over 1,500 astrologers in one place, 5 talks a day, and then a lot of mingling and drinking wine, or whatever's your pleasure.
What any highlights you'd like to mention of?
Yeah, I mean, there's different tracks. There's like the track of like you could see all talks about financial astrology if that was your thing, or see all talks about Vedic astrology, and I pretty much hung to the traditional track mostly, where the discussion centered a lot around like Hellenistic astrology, and it just really was coming out the paradigm of the daemon and the spirit, like especially like in the Arabic parts, what they call her the lots, is like the lot of spirit, and it's really that was translated as that, but really it was the lot of daemon, and trying to understand what exactly a daemon was, and it's your spirit, your personal spirit, like you have your physical body, and then you have your daemon, and the different parts of the soul and of the spirit and of the body and the being and the self. And just looking at the paradigm where astrology came from, as we know it, in the synchronistic period, like the syncretic period of where Egyptian and Greek culture combined, like around Alexandria, around the first few centuries, when astrology strongly gained a zodiac. As in the Egyptian period, it was much more stellar based, spirits of the sky and spirits of the stars. And it was in the Babylonian traditions where they started conceptualizing the circle of animals, as I mentioned earlier in this forecast, and the two starting to bond and be laid over on top of each other, and we inherit the tradition of astrology that we know, which was alive and well through the medieval period and through the Renaissance and the early modern period, but then around 1700 really fell from popularity as science, like the Age of Enlightenment and rationalism and laboratory science, became very prevalent, and then it was much more popular for the elite, to have laboratory equipment and be doing experiments in their own private laboratories, whereas before they were interested in things like astrology, and that was kind of like could be a hobby or a profession, of like more elite characters. But as the English Civil War, after the English Civil War, when the restrictions on the printing press were lifted, and you started to see kitchen physic and astrological tables being printed in almanacs that were cheap and put in the hands of the lower classes, and like the peasant classes who, there's no television or radio or internet, obviously, then this almanac was a big deal. You'd get the almanac of the year and everything would be in there. That's what people would look at and talk about. And so it was something that poor people did, and so like science was on the rise, rationalism was on the rise, and astrology fell into the hands of the uneducated, and it just was seen as superstition suddenly. So when it came back in the 60s and 70s, it came back with like at the same time as like Eastern philosophies were influencing the West, and then you get like the whole acid movement, the hippie movement, whatever, the counterculture, and you get astrology once again, but now you're getting it blended with other ideas from the East that were like appropriated and put out of context, and that's what gives you the kind of whole New Age aesthetic of astrology that we've known, but within astrology proper now. And it was really present in this conference, just looking at like, well, that Hellenistic world had its own paradigm and its own theological and magical and a worldview and philosophy built into it that's appropriate for the functioning of Western astrology, and just kind of returning to that, and resituating your astrology in the culture and context that it came from, and kind of restoring the continuity and context of spirituality and the kind of the arts of astrology and philosophy into like the original Western context, unbroken. So it was definitely interesting to see that taking effect, especially in a world right now where cultural appropriation is a huge issue, and like, what are we going to do about it, and then a lot of that is common sense, it's like you kind of know if you're tripping out, but on a bigger scale, to be like, well, let's put things back into context. Let's like, what worldview and philosophy does astrology operate from?
Wow.
And so that was really great to see, and I didn't go to all the financial astrology talks, but there might have been like other themes coming up in that world that I'm not aware of. I was really
just asking about your experience.
My experience,
there's 1,500 people there. There's, it'd be interesting to get a vastly different perspective from somebody who went to just the financial or...
Yeah, I would have loved to have gone to it all.
Vedic,
but it was really cool. There was like an open call to restore the magical traditions of astrology, which are often ignored by astrology proper. And so we're looking probably at more discussions about that in future conferences and in the astrological community,
especially with
more
that,
directly.
Yeah. And I mean, especially with that Jack Parsons TV show coming out.
Yeah, that's
What's
something.
it called? Strangel?
Strange Angel. yeah, I said Strange Angel. You said, why didn't they just call it Strangel? I was like, well, they could have called it Strangle. You know? Yeah, it's that was something I put in my list of Uranus and Taurus kind of things popping up, and who's more Uranian than Ridley? Ridley Scott's the producer. I was going to say who's more Promethean than Jack Parsons, probably.
Yeah. Spoiler alert, he blows himself up.
Yeah, right. Yeah, if Jack Parsons is maybe the second on the list of Uranian figures, other than like probably Prometheus himself, right? But yeah, so that debuts. We're recording on the 13th. The show is going to broadcast on the 17th, but on the 14th, this dramatization of Jack Parsons' life and experiences called Strange Angel is going to debut on CBS, like all access, right?
Crazy.
So just, and like I said, produced by Ridley Scott, who did the Alien movies, who I wasn't following those, but I know that he had started to weave into the series of sequels like a kind of Gnostic narrative. So he's acquainted with presenting occult ideas, esoteric ideas to the masses in like some sort of Hollywood digestible form.
Yeah, we watched the trailer. It looks I'd watch it.
Yeah,
I mean, of course you're gonna watch it.
Yeah, you have to watch it.
Yeah.
Which I mean, I guess like I don't know if I mean to say that to the listeners, like you have to watch this.
Yeah,
like,
it's not like that. Yeah,
I'm not in control of your media consumption, but if I were you, I'd check it out. And that's just going to be, like Bonnie's saying, that's going to be an interesting thing to like introduce magic and the occult to people in this form, that it's just something they saw on TV. You know, it's just in a TV show, which is interesting. It's that you get both sides of it. You get like more information sharing, more awareness of things and concepts and histories, but also you get this kind of like, oh, I know about that. I saw that Jack Parsons TV show, like kind of disseminating the information in
rubbish,
in like a way it's no longer weaponized, you know. Mm-hmm. But some people will be like, well, this is interesting, I want to know more. But it's kind of just like putting it out there in a diluted form.
Peter Gray was talking about this sort of trend of magic and how, you know, it will eventually fade, but if like a few good people learn about it, a few of the right people learn about it and continue on with it, then it's totally worth it. Yeah,
true. Yeah, totally. It always spikes up, and spike in this situation being definitely like a Uranus word. You have Uranus changing signs and going into Taurus, where it's more mellow, but it's also more sedentary, like couch potato activity. And so you get like the Jack Parsons television show, which is really interesting. But yeah, it's true. And I think one of the big narratives of Uranus and Taurus is going to be the final switch over to animism as a paradigm, you know, and rationalist materialism is obviously broken even within the academy, within academic work, and within science. Everyone's starting to be like, well, this doesn't work. We've been hitting problems with this for years and years, like in physics and big time now in anthropology, right? You know, that once you figure out that, like, to say that a culture you're studying believes in these kind of like superstitions, essentially, the whole discussion of decolonization basically goes out the window, you know. So you're like, the worldview has to fit that everyone's belief in what's happening is correct, but it within its own context, but that, you know, the majority of, like, a huge percentage of the world, other than the materialist, rationalist West, has beliefs in kind of like a spiritual, that, you know, that matter has spirit, that nature has spirit, that, you know, that places have spirit. So, yeah, it's definitely something that's coming to a head. And I think, bring it back to what we're saying about the dilution of esoteric and occult traditions being distributed and disseminated to the populace, and the rise of casual witchcraft right now. I think what a lot of people are really trying to say when they're like, oh, well, I'm a witch, it's like very common now. It's like almost like the people say it's like the religion of the millennials, right? Is like witchcraft. But it's not that they're actually practicing witchcraft or have any interest in initiating themselves into like traditional craft paths. But really, I think all they're trying to say is they're animist, but they don't have the word for it in their lingo yet. But that's really, they're not really doing anything. They're not doing witchcraft, but they see the world from an animistic perspective that witchcraft sees it from, and that essentially like a way for the West to reroot itself into like a more shamanic kind of worldview.
Well, that's exciting.
So yeah, it can all be wrapped together in what Uranus does to innovate in Taurus, as Taurus is like the preparation for fertility and like the greening of the world, like the growth and greening and possible disasters too is part of Taurus. So there's going to be a lot of shakeup, but I think a lot of innovation. Like we kept looking at like all the Uranus and Taurus affecting textile industries. And so you had brought up some new stuff, right?
Yeah, nothing specifically with textile, but there's now Gucci Equilibrium that has been launched, and it's an online platform designed to connect people, planet, and purpose. Quotes. And let's see, they have a 10-year sustainability plan centered around 3 pillars, which are the environment, people, and innovation. And it goes on to say, within the first pillar, it has set a target to guarantee the traceability of 95% of raw materials. Its scrapless program in association with its tanneries, which reduces the quantity of leather that is treated during the manufacturing process, follows the announcement in October of 2017 that the house will no longer use fur in any of its collections. It's definitely worth looking into, and it's I think that it's just something that more people will follow, because Gucci is becoming so monstrous right now. The fashions are just completely over the top and eclectic, and it's talking to great numbers, whereas I don't know, it didn't seem like it was ever like this before. I mean, I think Tom Ford, of course, did a lot of really great designs for Gucci, and probably that's like maybe one of the more iconic that I can remember. But Alessandro Michele is just like completely changing the face and making this brand that needed big change to be accessible to many young people. So with Gucci Equilibrium, I'm hopeful that it will set up a kind of system of design houses to be more sustainable in their actions.
Yeah, it's interesting that like that eclecticism that you're talking about is so Uranian, That's just kind of like, okay, yeah, let's just really change it up, make it random, throw a bunch of elements together. And it's interesting that I'm sorry, go on. It's interesting that it's called Equilibrium, is not like Uranus knocks stuff out of equilibrium, right? Like, but the world is so knocked out of equilibrium already that it kind of needs to the hammer blow to the scales that like swings it back. It's like when something's broken and you hit it,
Yeah.
Like what's going on here, and you hit it and it kind of resets itself.
Or like restart it, unplug it.
Yeah, if only we could.
Yeah, I know. The new Gucci show, the Resort 2019, took place outside of Milan in the Ali Comp's burial ground outside. It's an outside show. It was a garden lined with the stone sarcophagi of the Roman rulers who occupied the city. the playground of the Emperor Constantine. Bells tolled, sepulchral music filled the air, a line of fire coursed along a central channel in the walkway, and the pictures suddenly fit together as yet another phantasmagorical extension of the multi-layered time-collapsing world inside Michel's head. He, too, is a Roman after all, a conqueror of fashion in the age of digital communication, and a man whose work has been made persistent reference to past civilizations, death, and an imagined afterlife.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. That's like a good context for where witchcraft might be situated. It's time collapsing. It's rooted into the dead and communing with the dead. And I don't agree with everything that he's, with all his fashions. They're not all my cup of tea, but I like that historical referential time collapsing nature of it. That it's like the event is now.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's really interesting. And I think if people if this whole modern idea of witchcraft is going to go anywhere, it needs to connect into the dead.
Yeah.
That's what it does. That's the shamanic element. That's what makes it real. And so seeing that happen on that scale is interesting, and see if that's something that people start enacting themselves in their own lives. But it's
still fun to watch, even if you don't even agree with all of the fashion themselves. It's just still a gorgeous show.
Yeah. So you had also brought up some stuff about food and diet.
Oh yeah, they well, I love the website inhabitat.com. And one of the articles I've read today, it's the title is "These Fish and Meat Options Are the Most Environmentally Costly," and so that ends with the statement that when compared to other studies of vegetarian and vegan diets, a selective diet of aquaculture and wild capture fisheries has a lower environmental impact than either of the plant-based diets, according to the university.
Yeah, and so that's, people are always going to debate diets and what diet is.
Excuse me, it's the University of Washington.
Okay.
That was important.
Yeah. Yeah, it's always going to be up to debate what is the most sound diet environmentally, or what diet has the least impact but is the healthiest for our bodies. That's because it seems simplistic in a way. It's everyone has a different temperament. If you're thinking Ayurveda, and everyone has a different dosha,
mm-hmm.
or if you're saying humorally, a sanguine person eats differently than a phlegmatic person, So
mm-hmm.
of course, without taking that into consideration, there's going to be well, this is the best way to eat, or
oh my gosh.
this is absolutely the best way to eat, where it's really going to be different for region and for temperament. But either way, with Uranus and Taurus, and seeing the fluctuations in economy and in food, and and how they interrelate, that debate I feel is going to become much more an emergency debate coming up.
Definitely. And I mean, I think that the main the point of this makes it a little different, is that it's the most environmentally costly.
Right.
So it's not really.
Yeah,
just
I guess those are the words. How it's the impact of the environment and the cost.
Yes.
Right.
So that. That's changing the game a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
It's not just what is going to make you burn the most fat and be the
right.
most whatever it is that you're trying to be. It's really just about what the impact of your diet has on the environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I mean, that's just such a theme. It's just going to keep on being that way. Is how do your actions, what are your choices, how are they affecting the environment, and that...
Yeah, which is interesting to see. That's those are the arguments we had with like our parents when we were teenagers.
I know. And they're like, oh, you're crazy.
You're crazy. Yeah. Like you're radical or whatever. But now it's becoming normal. It's like, it's not a radical idea anymore. It's just,
my mom's like, nobody uses Roundup anymore. Whereas she used to use that,
Yeah. Spoiler alert. So I was looking around for other things that were fitting the current astrology. And there was one that just, that really stuck out, which is in Italy, the interior minister blocks the migrant rescue vessel named Aquarius from docking in Italy, sparking arguments with the French president Macron, who criticized the interior minister Salvini, who's of the new far right in Italy. He's very anti-migrant, and it's really interesting because it's called Aquarius, and the South Node is in Aquarius right now with Mars right on top of it, and that's going to be one of the major themes of the summer, the activity there. And then opposite that, where the North Node is in Leo, and then we just recently, a couple months ago, watched a talk with Nick Dagan-Best, who's does a lot of work with Uranus cycles and countries, and Uranus's activity in Leo really is rooted into France and all the revolutions, and you see like it in the charts of like Napoleon, et cetera, that just has this Leo cultural kind of revitalization and like in revolution kind of story. And America's is Gemini, and then he says that possibly China or Germany is Taurus. So that's interesting to watch right now. But just that France has this Leo signature, and then like the vessel's called Aquarius, and there's like this like obvious like Aquarius Leo friction going on, where it couldn't be more like, it's just like literally using the astrological words and them just coming up in current events,
Yeah.
Because that's big right now, is like Mars has been hovering right on top of the South Node, and that's been a big part of the story, and will be a big part of the story for the solstice, which I just saw this morning, that I think it was yesterday, as far as when I recorded this. The astrologer Gary P. Caton has pointed out that Mars and Venus are going to go opposite on the solstice, and that it's more than a normal occurrence, because I guess usually almost every time Mars is retrograde when it opposes Venus, because Venus only gets a certain distance away from the sun, only ever 2 signs. It can't get, because it's between the Earth and the sun. From our perspective, it can't get more than 2 signs away.
Right.
And so if Mars is able to oppose Venus, it has to be nearly opposed the sun, which when Mars is opposed the sun, it's retrograde. But it does it right before Mars stations retrograde now. So it's a rare direct Mars opposing Venus, which means that this is also rare in Venus-Mars opposition. So Mars is the morning star right now, and Venus is the evening star. So Mars is rising before the sun, which makes Mars oriental and makes Mars more yang than he usually is. It makes Mars like, it's like Gary Caton describes how it's a tipping point between like, Mars says like act first, and Venus says like, and then you do your value judgments on how you act, right? And then after they switch, because Mars is going to go retrograde and Venus is going to go retrograde in the fall, and then they switch positions of evening and morning star. And at that point, Venus will be rising before the sun, and then it becomes a period where it's going to be more about making value judgments and then deciding what action to take. And that this occurrence of this opposition on the solstice, which astrologers always look at the solstice chart, especially in ancient times where that was considered, like in the Thema Mundi, the chart of the universe, the chart of the world, that 0 Cancer was the start of the zodiac, where now we think of it as 0 Aries. But so this is still a chart that you look at for mundane astrology to make predictions. And you see right on the solstice, you have this like rare Venus-Mars opposition, which is the last time that they made this opposition was in 1860. And it coincided with the nomination of Lincoln, who became elected later in the year. But and it was in Aquarius and Leo as well. Like Mars and Venus were pretty much in the same positions on the nodes, but the nodes were reversed. So there's definitely going to be some sort of, when we pull back and look later, there's going to be some sort of character to that 1860 opposition that relates to now. They're like, it's part of the same narrative. And so Lincoln being elected was, what led to finally the abolition of slavery in America. Mm-hmm. And so it's going to be really, Gary Caton is going to be talking about it on his podcast called the Hermetic Astrology Podcast. So everyone should go and try to check that out if you're interested in this subject. And his website is dreamastrologer.com. He does really cool work. But yeah, just pointing out that this solstitial opposition of Mars and Venus is actually quite rare. It's not just like a, I think the word he uses, he's surprised astrologers look at them as ho-hum, when really if you look at like what's retrograde, what's direct, what phase things are in, you're like, oh, this is actually a rare opposition.
We just had the primary elections last night or yesterday in Maine and in many other states too, which is funny because it's like that is deciding who gets to run for. I mean, it decided other things, but also who gets to run for governor of those states.
Right.
And so it's very hopeful to have that. What you were talking about with Lincoln. To be. Yeah,
and of course that led to the Civil War, but it led
right.
to which when Uranus goes into Gemini, something's going to happen in America. Like the first Uranus in Gemini was, when America was established, the American Revolution, and then when Uranus went into Gemini again, we had the Civil War, and then when Uranus went into Gemini again, America got involved in World War II. So. There's definitely like to see that like this last time we had this Mars opposition is right before the events that led to the Civil War. And then we're 7 years away from the next Uranus and Gemini like events in America. So, good things on the rise, but they come through like a revolution of sorts. There's things that there's tumult and things come to a head, So, I mean, definitely our world needs it, as we can't get out of this one without some radical change, Mm-hmm. But anyway, so interesting to look at. And then it was interesting also to look at just how loaded the solstices are right now. Like if you think that we're between two solstices, we're between the winter solstice and the summer solstice. And the winter solstice, we saw, the Sun and Saturn come conjunct and kind of pass over into Capricorn almost simultaneously. And so you had this real like ushering in the Saturn and Capricorn era, the 3-ish years where Saturn returns to his domicile right on the solstice. And then on the next solstice, the Sun comes in with this rare Mars-Venus opposition, as well as almost immediately sextiling Uranus newly in Taurus. So these are not uneventful solstice events. You could definitely look at this and say like, oh, this is like, if you're looking at solstices to look at mundane charts, you'd be like, oh, there's some activity in these years. Some stuff happens here.
Yeah.
It was just kind of interesting looking at mythologically what the solstice is and why it sits where it does, and the Sun entering into Cancer and Capricorn. And I was going back through and looking at Cerberus's involvement and spirits that correspond with Cerberus corresponding to 0 degrees of Cancer. And if you go back and look into the Rig Veda, you have the dogs of Yama who were chasing the orbit of the Sun and the Moon, which were thought of as like they were a pair of dogs, like Anubis was part of a pair or had a pair of dogs in Egypt, and they were thought of in Greece as like luminary islands, like the islands of Hades, that were in the sun and the moon. And then Cerberus was an offspring of Typhon, and Anubis being an offspring of Set. That syncretization came together so neatly between Egyptian and Greek cultures. And Anubis, he would be positioned like on the sunset side of the Nile, where across from the city where jackals were always howling, and that was considered the land of death. and Cerberus guarded the entrance of the underworld on the other side of the river Styx. And so that celestial degree of zero Cancer, you can think of as like the waters of Cancer. Like it used to be, that's before precession, the star Sirius was at that degree, and then it was called Sothis, and it marked the rise of Sirius, or Sothis was the flooding of the Nile that began the cycle of seasons, and so it's as if like you cross the river Styx and encounter Cerberus, the dog star Sirius, as you're going to that incarnation point in the year, that incarnation-excarnation point. So it's the initial point of the zodiacal thema mundi, the chart of the universe, and the barrier between life and death, and darkness and light. And the underworld descent myths involve Cerberus ordeals, and such as Orpheus and Hercules. And Hercules prepared for his ordeal by initiation into the Eleusinian mysteries. So there's like this necromantic character of these solstice points. And in Europe, their aromatic plants would be burned. And they would burn 9 different woods to smudge the pasture lands and protect their lands and banish parasites and illness and people and animals. And they would situate the bonfires on hills over flowing water often. And in the older myths, the underworld was often on a hilltop, and the hilltop and the underworld were one. Like you go up so high and then you're below, as if it was like a hollow hill, and the stars in the sky were the dead and fallen heroes or ancestors. So below and above form a continuum, and they would jump over the fires and say charms and conduct, like with effigies, like sympathetic magic, burning mugwort and vervain and rue and fennel and pennyroyal. And the solstitial points were points of incarnation and excarnation, where the Milky Way and the ecliptic cross, as if like 2 celestial rivers crossing. And it was on the day of longest light, or the day of longest darkness, who in the Mithraic rites were the torchbearers, Cautes and Cautapotes. And so they each have a torch, and then Hecate also bears dual torches, and she is the one who's mythologically holds Cerberus in chains. So it links back again to Cerberus, who is ritually offered a cake of barley meal and honey to gain passage into the underworld. And so is Hecate, often on new moons for Hecate suppers. So it makes sense. This is all leading up to my suggestion. It would make sense that, as the Northern Europeans did, to work with the green wolf on St. John's Eve, which falls on the 23rd or the 24th, but it really was just a repositioning of solstice. And as this is a water crossing celestially and seasonally, and that it was the day of John the Baptist. So collecting and smudging herbs and aspersing yourselves with water in your home, as he was the one who had baptized, and then it would be in a river. So it's like the same. It's crossing that celestial river into like a new era of light and darkness, into a new season. And so to smudge yourself in your home with herbs, asperse yourselves, spray blessed, get water from a spring or a river, especially like a moving water, and offer barley and honey to guardian dogs as you pass into summer and the sun passes into the house of the moon.
So beautiful. So
some suggestions to keep in mind for how to kind of ritually move forward through the solstice. If you want to take it casually, just go swimming and have a fire.
Yeah, throw a steak to a dog.
Yeah, throw a steak to a dog. Yeah, give your dog some honey.
Also, we're going into I guess soon after. No, when does the K2 meditation begin?
Well, I think
40 days from the solstice.
In India, it would be 40 days from the eclipse. Yeah, so that's also a time to be nice to dogs. Mm-hmm. So there's an extra stress this year on the solstice as we move through into this period to pay extra attention to dogs and consider them the guardians of the barrier between life and death as we move into a turbulent season.
Yeah, and you can even just make a donation to a dog shelter.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we should.
Bring tennis balls to the dog shelter.
Yeah, everyone go gather up your tennis balls. go over to Paws.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think that's going to conclude our show for today. Do you have anything else, Vaughn?
No. I'm happy that we're back. I look forward to... when do we have our next guest?
Not sure.
We are moving into a once-a-month format, right?
We're going to move into a once-a-month format next week. And so we'll do a whole show for July, and then we're just going to do a show each month. And I'll be trying to offer extra things that you can find from my website for additional content, and but keeping the show to like a month by month, so there's more time to work on other things and offer other things. And so we'll be with a guest, and we're going to open up the dialogue a little bit more to include more of the discussing art and culture and magic as much as astrology. So hopefully you'll be with us as we make this transition into new things and new topics.
We're very excited about it, and I hope that you are too.
Yeah, and get more interactive. So we'll be able to invite you into more activities soon and more discussions. So see you on the flip side.